Picture the sky still painted in deep blue, the stars beginning to fade as the first ray of sunlight timidly announces its arrival. In the village, the silence of the early morning is broken by the rooster's crow, a natural alarm clock that echoes like a call to action. The peasants are already up, stretching their sore muscles after yet another day of toil. Their lives wait for no one and offer no mercy. The sun is their clock, and the land, their boss. The routine starts early, very early. While the mist still lingers over the fields, they are already out, their calloused hands gripping hoes firmly. The soil, hard and often ungrateful, demands strength and patience. Every furrow carved into the ground is a small victory, but also a promise, the promise that it would yield sustenance for their families. The peasant knows every inch of that land as if it were an extension of themselves. They know where the soil is most fertile, where the water runs after the rain, and where the wind blows strongest in winter. But it wasn't just about planting and harvesting. Life in the fields was a symphony of endless tasks. While some tended to the crops, others were in the stables, feeding the animals. Cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep were part of the family, providing milk, eggs, and, eventually, meat. Fixing fences, cleaning barns, and even helping build new granaries were chores that couldn't wait. And of course, there were the obligations to the feudal lord. Certain days of the week were dedicated to working on the castle's lands, where the peasants' sweat wasn't for their own sustenance, but for the luxury of those living behind stone walls. The pace was relentless, but there was a certain poetry to this routine. The sound of tools striking the earth, the distant bleating of sheep, the rustling of leaves in the wind, it all created a unique melody, the soundtrack of rural life. And amidst the exhaustion, there were also moments of lightness, a joke here, a story there, a sip of fresh water drawn straight from the well. It was in these small pauses that the spirit was renewed. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the peasants finally called it a day. Tools were put away, animals were herded back, and families gathered around the table for a simple but lovingly prepared meal. The dark, dense rye bread was shared, accompanied by a vegetable soup and, if luck was on their side, a piece of cheese or bacon. And so life went on, day after day, season after season. The work was hard but necessary. The peasant knew that without the sweat on their brow, there would be no bread on the table, no harvest for the winter. It was an existence of struggle, but also of pride. After all, as the saying goes, soft water, hard stone, drips until it bores a hole. And they, with their calloused hands and resilient hearts, were the water itself, shaping the world around them, drop by drop. Imagine a world where the ground you walk on, the air you breathe, and even the roof that shelters you from the rain are not truly yours. This was the daily reality of the medieval peasant. The land they toiled on from sunrise to sunset did not belong to them. Everything, absolutely everything, was the property of the feudal lord, who ruled over those lands like a small earthly god. He was the king of the hill, the owner of the fields, the forests, the rivers, and, in many ways, the lives of those who lived under his dominion. In exchange for a piece of land to cultivate, the peasant had to pay a high price, and not just in coins, which they often didn't even have. Payment came in the form of labor, sweat, and sacrifice. A portion of the harvest, sometimes even half, went straight to the lord's granaries. And that wasn't all. There were the corvée days, when the peasant was forced to work for free on the castle's lands, planting, harvesting, building, or doing any other task the lord demanded. It was a heavy burden, but a necessary one, because, as the saying goes, he who has a godfather doesn't die a pagan. Except, in their case, the godfather was their own oppressor, and the demands didn't stop there. Every now and then, the feudal lord would show up with new fees, a piece of cheese here, a few chickens there, or even a percentage of the wool from the sheep. It was an endless list of obligations, and the peasant had to scramble to meet them all. If the harvest was poor, despair would knock at the door. How could they pay what they didn't have? The answer often came in the form of debts, piling up like a sword hanging over their heads. But it wasn't all pure exploitation. There was a pact, an unspoken agreement between the lord and the peasant. In exchange for so much work and sacrifice, the lord offered protection. In a world full of dangers, invasions, bandits, wars, The castle was a refuge. When the winds of war blew, the peasants could run inside the walls, where they would be safe, at least in theory. Additionally, the feudal lord was responsible for administering justice, resolving disputes, and maintaining order. Of course, this justice wasn't always fair, but it was better than the law of the jungle. Loyalty to the feudal lord was one of the pillars of medieval society. The peasant had no choice but to be loyal. After all, they depended on the lord to survive. But this loyalty wasn't always voluntary. There was a constant fear of retaliation. Disobeying the lord could mean losing the land, the home, or even their life. And yet, even under such control, the peasants found ways to resist. A hidden grain here, a less intense day of work there. Small acts of rebellion that kept the flame of dignity alive. And when the lord decided to increase the demands, patience. That was the mantra. The peasant knew that complaining wouldn't help. Life was hard, but it was the only life they knew. And as they said, soft water, hard stone, drips until it bores a hole. Little by little, drop by drop, they kept resisting, surviving, and in some way, keeping alive the hope for better days. Imagine a place where everyone knows everyone, where each person's name is spoken with familiarity, where life stories intertwine like the branches of the trees surrounding the village. This was the world of the medieval peasant, a web of relationships as strong as it was necessary. In the village, no one was an island. Survival depended on unity, on that old idea that one hand washes the other. Life in the countryside was hard, but the community made it a little easier. If someone fell ill, it didn't take long for neighbors to show up with a hot broth, made with vegetables from the garden and seasoned with herbs gathered from the fields. It was practical solidarity, without fanfare but full of meaning. After all, everyone knew that one day they might be the ones in need of help, and when one person's harvest failed, another would share what they had. A bag of grain here, a piece of cheese there. No one was left behind, because everyone knew that, at the end of the day, what goes around comes around. But it wasn't all pure altruism. Village life also had its friction. Gossip ran rampant, fueled by the long winter nights when families gathered around the fire to tell stories and, of course, talk about each other's lives. Who got married, who fought, who did this or that. It was a way to keep the community connected, but also to release the tensions of daily life. After all, as the saying goes, in a house where there's no bread, everyone fights and no one is right. And in the village, bread wasn't always plentiful. At the center of it all was the church. More than just a place of prayer, it was the heart of the community. It was where people gathered not only to pray, but also to celebrate. Baptisms, weddings, feast days of the patron saints. Everything was an occasion for a big gathering. The church was also the stage where everyday dramas were resolved. Land disputes, neighborly quarrels, accusations of theft or deceit. The priest often was the mediator, the voice of reason in a world where formal justice didn't always reach. And let's not forget the festivals. Oh, the festivals. They were the moments when the community could breathe a sigh of relief, even if only for a short time. The wheat harvest, the grape harvest, the end of winter, everything was a reason to dance, sing, and eat. Tables were set up in the church square or the village plaza, and everyone contributed what they could. One brought bread, another cheese, yet another a jug of wine. It was a celebration of life, of resilience, of the ability to keep going even when the world felt overwhelmingly heavy. But rural life wasn't just made up of moments of joy. There were also losses, sorrows, and goodbyes. When someone died, the entire village came to a standstill. The church bell tolled slowly, and neighbors gathered to mourn the body and comfort the family. It was a moment of shared pain, but also of unity. After all, everyone knew that, one day, it would be their turn. And so life went on in the village, a delicate balance between solidarity and conflict, between joy and sorrow. It was a simple existence, but deeply human. At the end of the day, what kept those people together wasn't just necessity, but also a sense of belonging, the certainty that together they were stronger. And as they said, he who has friends has everything. Picture a rustic table, its wood worn by time, surrounded by benches where entire families would sit. On it, there were no luxuries or elaborate dishes, but honest food, made from what the land provided and what their hands could create. The diet of the medieval peasant was simple: straightforward, yet filled with a flavor that came not just from the ingredients, but from the stories of those who cultivated them. Bread was the king of the table. Not the soft, fluffy white bread we know today, but a dark, dense loaf made from rye or barley. It was the staple, the companion to every meal. Sometimes when flour was scarce, other grains, herbs, or even tree bark were mixed in to stretch the dough. But still, it was bread. And bread in those days was synonymous with life. Alongside the bread came the soup. The soup. It was the dish that never failed to appear. A mix of vegetables, grains, and, if luck was on their side, a piece of bacon or a pork bone for flavor. Carrots, turnips, cabbage, beans, and peas were the most common ingredients, harvested straight from the garden each family kept behind their home. The soup simmered in a large cauldron over the fire for hours, until the flavors melded into something that, while simple, was deeply comforting. It was the food that warmed both body and soul, especially during the long, cold winters. Meat? That was a rare luxury. It only appeared on very special occasions, like religious festivals or bountiful harvests. When it was available, it was usually pork, as pigs were easier to raise and fatten. Chickens were common too, but they were often kept more for their eggs than their meat. And, of course, there was game. Rabbits, birds, and even deer might end up in the pot, but that depended on the hunter's skill and the luck of the day. But the medieval peasant wasn't just about survival. They also found ways to add flavor to life. They had their tricks. Herbs from the fields, like parsley, rosemary, and thyme, were used to season dishes. Wild berries, picked from the edges of the forest, added a sweet and tangy touch to meals. And let's not forget the cheese, that homemade cheese made from cows or sheep's milk, which could be fresh or aged depending on the time of year. It was a versatile food, eaten on its own, mixed into soup, or even used as barter in times of need. And of course, there were the drinks. Water wasn't always reliable, so the medieval peasant preferred something safer: beer and weak wine. Beer was brewed at home from fermented barley and had a low alcohol content, almost like an energy drink of the time. Wine, more common in regions where grapes grew, was diluted with water to make it last longer and to avoid drunkenness, at least during work. After all, as they said, water is for washing feet. Good drink was what came from the land and nourished the spirit. The diet of the medieval peasant was, above all, a reflection of the life they led, simple but full of meaning. Every piece of bread, every spoonful of soup, every sip of beer told a story of struggle, resilience, and creativity. It was food that filled not just the stomach, but also the heart. And at the end of the day, it was enough to keep going, with the certainty that, even in simplicity, there was a flavor worth celebrating. A village where work never ends until the bells ring. Joy from dawn till dusk, the village hummed with ceaseless labor. Peasants bent their backs to the soil, tended livestock with rough hands, mended fences with weary sighs, and fulfilled their feudal duties under the watchful eye of the Lord. Life was a tapestry of calluses and worries, woven with threads of exhaustion. Then the bells. A different sound, bright and beckoning, cut through the routine. The church bell's chime, usually solemn, now danced in the air. It was time to stop, to breathe, to remember joy. Sacred pauses in a world of toil. Religious festivals were the anchors of their year. Christmas, Easter, the feast days of patron saints, marking time like stitches in the fabric of seasons. The church, always the heart, drew them in for masses thick with incense and processions that wound through the fields like ribbons. But after the hymns faded, something wilder stirred. The village square erupted. Tables groaned under bread baked soft for once, soups rich with extra herbs, and if fortune smiled, the rare luxury of roasted meat. Ale and wine flowed like laughter. Someone brought out a drum, another, a flute carved from elderwood. Feet stamped rhythms into the earth, and for a night, the weight of survival lifted. Stories that fed more than hunger. As firelight licked the faces of elders, tales unspooled into the dark. Not just stories, warnings and wisdom dressed as magic. The werewolf haunting the forest's edge, howling at the full moon. The flickering fay-light that led the lost home. Every villager knew these weren't mere fables. They were lessons. Stay together. Respect the unknown. Beware the dark. Harvest feasts blurred piety with revelry. When the last sheaf of wheat was cut, when grapes burst sweet from the vine, when winter's grip finally cracked, they celebrated not just the yield, but the hope it carried. A full granary meant children wouldn't cry from hunger. The land had been kind. The alchemy of community arguments melted in the heat of shared song. Neighbors who'd squabbled over fence lines now clinked cups. For these hours, the village wasn't just huts and fields, it was a living creature, pulsing with music and firelight. Even grief eased its grip. The recent dead were toasted, their names woven into the night's stories. Then, as embers faded, reality crept back. Dawn would come, and with it, the plow. But something lingered, a warmth in the chest, a lightness in the step. The medieval peasant knew a truth we've forgotten. Survival needs joy as much as bread. And so they sang, not because life was easy, but because singing made it bearable. A world without certainty, the peasant's unending struggle. Each sunrise was a gamble. The medieval peasant woke not to promises, but to a daily war against the unyielding earth, the fickle skies, the ever-present specters of hunger and disease. This wasn't living, it was enduring, a test of grit against a world that gave no quarter. The ever-present shadow, hunger. A single bad harvest could unravel everything. Too much spring rain drowning seedlings, a summer sun that scorched fields to dust. These were death sentences in slow motion. When granaries emptied, meals became ghostly versions of themselves. Bread vanished from tables, soups thinned to watery echoes of vegetables long gone. Children's cries cut through cottage walls. Adults moved like shadows, their strength leaching away with their hope. In desperation, they turned scavenger. Roots pried from frozen ground, bark stripped from oaks, creatures even rats would ignore, anything to fill the hollow ache. This wasn't sustenance, it was surrender to necessity. The true reaper, disease hunger's sibling, was sickness, and it showed no mercy. A scraped knee could fester into fever. A child's cough at dawn might silence them by dusk. Medicine? A poultice of superstition and herbs, while death stood grinning at the door. Infant mortality was as common as rain. Families buried half their children before they could count to 10. Then came the Black Death, nature's cruel masterpiece. It didn't walk, it ravaged. Buboes swelling like rotten fruit, skin blackening, bodies piling faster than graves could be dug. The stench of decay clung to villages like a curse. Survivors wandered shell-shocked through empty streets, whispering to saints who seemed to have turned away. The anatomy of resilience, yet they persisted. Not through strength alone, but through stubborn alchemy. Faith as armor. Crucifixes clutched in blistered hands, prayers muttered like spells against the dark. Miracles were hoped for, if not expected. Laughter as defiance. Even as the plague carts rolled, dark jokes passed between cottages. What doesn't kill you fattens you up. Gallows humor to mock the reaper himself. Community as lifeline, a handful of grain left anonymously on a starving neighbor's step. A shared poultice of honey and yarrow. The silent understanding that isolation meant extinction. The quiet triumphs' victories were measured in crumbs. A harvest that didn't fail. A fever breaking at dawn. One more winter survived. Around evening fires, they spun stories not of kings, but of survival. The tale of how old Thomas outwitted the tax collector. The winter the village ate nothing but turnips and lived. These weren't just stories, they were blueprints for persisting. Epilogue, the light beyond. The medieval peasant knew what we've forgotten, that hope isn't the absence of despair, but the refusal to let it win. Their legacy isn't in the suffering, but in the sheer will to face each morning, despite it all. When modern folk complain of hardship, remember, we stand on the bones of those who endured the unendurable and still found reasons to kindle fires in the dark.